First of all, thank you so much, Colin, Jeremy, Joel, all my friends at AIJAC. It's a very special pleasure for me to be together with you. For you, it's good morning. For me, it's good evening here in New York. But it's been, as Colin said, nearly 30 years of partnership. AJC saw the Asia-Pacific region early on. In fact, by 1989, we had established the first Asia-Pacific Institute, certainly of any American Jewish organization. And I'm glad to be joined on this call this evening by its current and very able director, Colin, your partner as well, Shira Lowenberg. What we understood was this vast region, which you know far better than we do, being part of it, was fertile ground for Israel and the Jewish people. It had been largely unexplored for many years, if not decades, but increasingly the center of gravity, political, economic, diplomatic, cultural in the world was shifting to Asia. And not only did we need to be there, but we needed to seize the opportunities, and there were many. And I begin with countries like India and China, where there was no history of anti-Semitism to speak of. There was not the traditional baggage that we had to bring to the table every time we spoke to most European countries. There was admiration for the Jewish people. There was admiration for the Jewish mind. There was admiration for Israel's success. And so we could see country by country, year by year, this progress developing between our relations, Israel's relations, and Asia. And throughout it all, AIJAC and AJC were working shoulder to shoulder. And as Colin said, we've conferenced together, we've traveled together, we've advocated together, we've written and authored together. It's been a very, very fruitful relationship, and I'm glad to reaffirm that during this conversation.
Thanks, David. Thanks very much. Could I now turn to contemporary events? AJC.
I'd rather say in Asia, Colin, if we could.
Yeah. Well, it'd be good to stay in Asia, but and we will. But you've been involved in raising awareness and advocating against prejudice and racism and all its ugly forms, including anti-Semitism, for many years. Can you share with everyone perhaps your personal involvement in this area and your thoughts in particular on the current protests from both an American and Jewish community perspective, the sort of steps that we might take going forward, and in particular, in the context of the current Black Lives Matter protests, triggered obviously by the shocking demise of George Floyd. But to what extent are they being exploited, even hijacked by activists from the BDS and other anti-Israel campaigners? And if so, how can the Jewish community react to this type of problem?
There's a lot in that one question, Colin, so let me try and unpack it, please. And if I miss something, please come back to me. I mean, the personal story is a pretty simple and straightforward one, and that is that the three people in my life closest to me, my mother, my father, and my wife, were all direct targets of deadly anti-Semitism. My mother was born in the Soviet Union. She and her family were refugees from Stalin. They arrived in France in 1929. 1940, France fell to the Germans, and like many, they were fleeing south. They spent 17 months escaping and hiding before they were able to cross the Pyrenees and eventually arrive in the United States. My father was born in Budapest, Hungary. He spent most of his years in Austria until the Anschluss, fled the Nazis, came to France, was sent to the French Foreign Legion, was arrested by Vichy after France fell, spent 3 years in a Vichy labor camp in Western Algeria, successfully escaped on his second attempt, crossed the Sahara with a Berber caravan, briefly joined Montgomery's 8th Army, sweeping North Africa, was referred to OSS, the American Espionage Agency, was trained, parachuted behind enemy lines, and spent the last 18 months of the war in Austria and Yugoslavia. When the war ended, OSS brought him to the United States to help establish the CIA. My wife was born in Libya, where her family had lived for centuries. They were part of the Jewish community that was on that soil for nearly 2,000 years. but in fact, it will be July 14th. So in just over a month, 1967, after several weeks in hiding from raging mobs that were looking to kill Jews on the streets of Tripoli, they were given safe passage out of Libya, never to return. There is no Jewish community in Libya today. There is no trace of Jewish life. So when you ask Colin, what are the personal motivating factors, I don't have to go beyond my mother and my father and my wife's experiences to understand, number one, that anti-Semitism is real, number two, that it's deadly, and number three, and also to your point, that it comes from multiple sources. I also understood growing up as a Jew that if we're going to seek to protect Jews in the diaspora, the most successful strategy has to be not just a strong, proud Jewish self-defense, but a commitment to defending human dignity and human freedom and human rights for all. In other words, building strong, resilient, democratic, and pluralistic societies for all. This was obviously in the Jewish tradition of Tzelem Elohim, the prophetic vision. So it all came together. And AIJAC, I discovered in 1979, brought this kind of universal particular philosophy together under one roof. I joined in 1979. As you mentioned, I became the director in 1990. And so for the last 41 years, we've been on the front lines, both in the fight against anti-Semitism and in the fight against any manifestation of group racism or collective responsibility or collective guilt, believing that this is the best pathway to Jewish security and to the protection of human dignity.
So David, can I just follow up on that in terms
Please.
of potential exploitation by anti-Israel, anti-Semitic activists in the current protests, the BLM protests, and what to do about it?
Well, if we talk about the current situation,
yes,
Colin, there really are two elements that have been of concern to us at AIJAC. The first began with COVID-19, which is not a distant memory. For those of us here in New York, it's still very much a factor. But we understood, it doesn't take much understanding of history to realize that whenever there's a crisis of this magnitude, whether it's financial or public health or what have you, that there's likely very quickly to be conspiracy mongering, and it won't be long before the Jews are somehow drawn into it, no matter what the origins might be. Here, the origins were told in a Chinese city, and yet it wasn't long before, according to one survey that you may have seen in Great Britain, 20% of the respondents believed that Jews were somehow responsible for bringing on COVID-19. And then, of course, there were the Iranian theories, and of course, the web is an accelerant, a launching pad for all of these conspiracy theories, too many of which have included the Jews. So as we were dealing with that, thinking we have our hands full, now along comes sort of a new movement that, among other things, is alleging that the American Jewish Committee and one or two other Jewish organizations are complicit in the unfolding story in America because, they allege, we have been involved in bringing police forces to Israel to train. The assertion being to train in police brutality, to train in targeting specific racial groups. This is patently absurd, but the fact that it's patently absurd does not prevent this kind of conspiracy theory from spreading like wildfire. And in the current highly inflammable, highly polarized American environment today, there are too many people on whatever side of the equation who are too quick to believe just about anything. So here it begins with a tragic story in Minneapolis, a white policeman caught on video, inexplicably, inhumanely, taking the life of someone with 8 minutes and 46 seconds of his knee on the man's neck as he was trying to say, "I can't breathe." And that horrific story, for some, kind of moves on to the American Jewish Committee, by implication the Jews, by implication Israel, are directly involved in police brutality, Exhibit A being what happened in Minneapolis. So as if we didn't have our hands full with COVID-19, and by the way, just before that, with the resurgence of anti-Semitism that we were all discussing prior to the current crisis, now we have these additional layers, Colin.
Thanks, David. Lies indeed do have long legs, and they must be exposed and contested, as you do so well. My third question, the last one from me before I hand over to Jeremy Jones, is really on the current and very contentious Trump peace plan and the possibility, unclear as it is, confused as it is, that Israel might extend sovereignty to parts of the West Bank, be it parts of Eastern Jerusalem and limited parts of the West Bank. But my question is really, if Israel did do that, and it's not clear what Israel is going to do at this stage, but if it did, what would be the effect on support for Israel in the US, amongst American Jewry for a start, and more broadly? And what's your own view, AJC's view, about the costs and benefits of acting in that way, or not acting in that way at this time?
So as you said, Colin, and I want to be mindful that there is no Israeli decision yet. We're not privy to the behind the scenes thinking of the Prime Minister and others. So it's really speculative. And our position is to wait and see what the Israelis actually do, as opposed to what others think they might do. We'll see. Analytically, from a cost-benefit analysis, clearly whatever benefit there might be for those Israeli leaders espousing this view, there is likely to be a high cost. And the high cost is likely to come first and foremost from the region, beginning with Jordan. AJC hosted on our daily public call yesterday a discussion with the ambassador of Jordan to the United States. And she was very clear in messaging from Jordan's perspective what she thought the cost of this would be. The Europeans have been no less clear in sending a message that from the perspective of most in the EU, not all, but most, 6 countries in the EU have been particularly vocal, including France and Belgium and Ireland and Spain, that there will be a cost. And clearly here in the United States, there's likely to be a cost as well within the Democratic Party. For us, the key to US support for Israel, just as is in the case in Australia, is to ensure bipartisan support, to ensure that this issue does not become a wedge issue between one party and the other, knowing that sooner or later the pendulum swings, whether in Australia or the United States. But there is a real risk here of the weakening of support in the Democratic Party. A number of leaders have actually said so I'm simply reflecting their point of view. So the cost could be quite high. So let's wait and see what the Israelis do. I assume that everything you and I are discussing, Colin, is well known to all the Israeli decision makers. And I assume they will factor all of these elements into whatever decision they do or do not make in the coming weeks and months.
Thanks, David. The devil is certainly in the detail, and I think your caution is, in terms of making judgment about this, is well placed and certainly shared by us here. Let's wait to see what actually unfolds, not only in Israel, but also there are different strands of opinion, it would seem, within the US administration. Can I now hand the ball over to my colleague, Jeremy Jones, who you know very well, who's worked with AJC, especially in the interfaith area, at a very high level over the years. Jeremy, are you there?
I certainly am. Good morning, everybody, or afternoon, depending on where you're watching from, or even evening. I just want to remind those who are in the Zoom meeting that when I finish asking a few questions, we'll be going to your questions. When you click on the participants link at the bottom of your page, you will see the facility to raise your hand to ask a question. So it would be great if you want to ask a question that way, but you can also put a question in the chat or email or through Facebook, and we'll do our best to cover as much ground as possible in the question. But David, when we first met, we were introduced by Hyman Bookbinder back in your days as a Soviet Jewry activist. And at that time, you were raising the issue that of all the issues confronting the Jewish world at the moment, this was the really big one. What happened there was going to have an impact not only on the Jewish world, but on humanity. And a few years ago in Washington, we were talking also about the issue relating to the largest challenge facing the Jewish world today. And at that time, you identified it as the relationship with the Muslim world, something that was going to be a long-term change, that you wanted to play a role in guiding or being part of the Jewish community in this engagement. And I'm very interested to hear now, as I'm sure we all are, on your reflections on where we are in that relationship, particularly with AJC's role, and where we can go to.
Absolutely, Jeremy. And thank you, by the way, for your own decades-long work in the interfaith field, often alongside us and us alongside you. So yes, years ago, I began to say publicly that just as the relationship with the Christian world, and especially the Catholic Church, was the centerpiece of AJC's interfaith work in the 20th century, successfully culminating in 1965 in the Second Vatican Council and the adoption of Nostra Aetate, after which we began to see this unfolding and very positive revolution in Catholic-Jewish relations, that the 21st century interfaith challenge for us was going to be Muslim-Jewish relations, and we at AJC were determined to be in the forefront. So just to pick a few highlights, Jeremy, in 2016, we launched the Muslim-Jewish Advisory Council, the first national body in the United States, drawing together Muslim and Jewish leaders committed to beginning a serious conversation that led to cooperation and not simply to more conversation. And that cooperation domestically has already resulted in several legislative victories, both on the federal and on the state level, with, we hope, more to come, and of course, friendships being forged at one and the same time. But the thing that I'm particularly proud of, which I think was really a great breakthrough, happened just a few months ago in January of this year. Last year, we had signed an MOU with the leader of the Muslim World League. Now, the Muslim World League may be the most influential Sunni Muslim institution in the world. They are headquartered in Mecca, Saudi Arabia. Now, imagine the entourage that comes from Mecca to the American Jewish Committee in New York with a full complement of journalists and TV cameras from the Arab world. And before those cameras, we signed an MOU. And the first step in that MOU, Jeremy, was that this January 2020, we would go together to Auschwitz in order to commemorate the 75th anniversary of the camp's liberation. Now, I needn't tell this audience, I'm sure, that an understanding of the Holocaust is not necessarily widespread throughout the Muslim world. First of all, many were geographically distant. And secondly, as we know, some have diminished the importance of the Holocaust, questioned its validity. So here we were, the head of the Muslim World League from Mecca, who in turn invited 62 Muslim leaders from around the world to join him, and the American Jewish Committee, walking together under the entrance to Auschwitz and the infamous Arbeit macht frei. We spent many hours in Auschwitz together. The media covered the story fully, so it was widely aired throughout the Arab world and well beyond. And it was quite remarkable to see the impact of the visit, the impact of the exhibits, of children's shoes, of eyeglasses, of suitcases, of human hair that completely absorbed our Muslim friends. They were not prepared for this. They had no readiness, but they were completely emotionally drained by it. And it was powerful as we were completing our visit in Birkenau, just a few feet from the remnants of the crematoria, that they conducted a Muslim prayer service on that spot. A very, very touching moment. The next day, by the way, we were in Warsaw together. We went to the synagogue together. The leader of the Muslim delegation gave a sermon, I suspect the first sermon in 100 years in a Warsaw synagogue of a Muslim leader from Mecca, Saudi Arabia. And he said, among other things, Jeremy, I'm paraphrasing, that there were those today who questioned whether the Holocaust happened. He called those people neo-Nazis. a very, very powerful statement. And we concluded the visit Friday evening with an interfaith Shabbat dinner, led by AJC's Rabbi David Rosen, whom you and Colin know well, the Polish Foreign Minister, the Secretary of State, the President of the Polish Senate, the leaders of the Polish churches, joined together with AJC and with this large Muslim delegation. So we're off and running. We've done some very important things together. Next week, we have the AJC Virtual Global Forum. It should have been a real global forum in Berlin, Germany for the first time in our history. And Mohammed Al-Issa, the gentleman I'm speaking about, was scheduled to be in Berlin with us, speaking at Sachsenhausen, the Nazi concentration camp on the outskirts of Berlin. Instead, he will be with us in our opening session via Zoom. So we're continuing the conversation and the cooperation domestically in the United States and internationally. Yes, this is the 21st century issue for AJC.
Right. And one of the questions which is what has come to us, AIJAC, during this Zoom conversation, but is also directly related to what you've just been speaking about, is the developing relations between the Jewish world and Israel and Arab states, not just the Muslim community. You mentioned the event with the ambassador for Jordan, and you've mentioned relations, or we know of relations with other Arab states, issues of Rabbi David Rosen himself going to Saudi Arabia. So there is a relationship with the states as well as with the Muslim community. I wondered if you could say something about some of the challenges, especially, not especially, but including those which will come from people in the Jewish community questioning the value or wisdom or what is actually going on with this relationship, but also the benefits you're seeing already flow from it.
So there's always going to be a segment of any community, in this case the Jewish community, Jeremy, that is going to try and block any attempt at sort of forging new relationships. And they're frozen in history. They're paralyzed by history. And I don't think that's the way for us to chart our future. We can always point to things that are objectionable in the past, but we're not going to go anywhere if we continue along that pathway. AJC met those objections when we launched our conversation with the Catholic Church early in the 20th century. AJC encountered those objections after the Second World War, when we began to engage with the Federal Republic of Germany in 1949, 1950. And as you said, AJC encounters those who say, you know, how dare you engage with any Muslim, because if you go deep into their social media history or something, you'll find something objectionable. But again, we're willing to take some calculated risks because we believe that things can be changed. We've seen it in the Catholic Church, we've seen it in our relationship with Germany, and we're determined to ensure that at least important elements within this vast Muslim community around the world, that we engage with those who are willing to engage with us. It doesn't mean immediate instant agreement on every issue, but then again, even with my wonderful wife who's in the next room, we have the occasional difference which actually makes for a better marriage and a more interesting marriage. So we're not going to let the naysayers and the skeptics and the cynics prevent us from going forward and looking for potential partners and trying to write a new history. And look, you're doing the very same thing, including in neighboring Indonesia. Colin earlier spoke about our joint work over decades, even last week, in our conversations with Indonesian leaders. None of these programs are linear. They don't simply go smoothly from A to B to C to D. There are occasional potholes along the way. There are occasional diversions along the way, but we're trying to keep our eye focused on the goal. And if we can engage important elements of the larger Muslim world, and as you said, we're seeing it now in Israel's expanding relations in the region. We've been traveling to the region for over 30 years. We have been in touch regularly with more than half of the members of the Arab League. When you consider that only a handful have diplomatic relations with Israel openly, we, AJC, are dealing with a lot of countries that don't, but are interested and increasingly eager these days. So we're exploring.
One other issue that we see reflected very much, at least in readings of the Jewish media and beyond, is the polarization, not only within America, but within the American Jewish community, political polarization. And I know that AJC has invested a great deal of time and effort and energy and resources into trying to keep the Jewish community as cohesive as it can be on the big issues. Particularly interesting is the relationship between the generations who understand the birth of Israel and were united by that. We're united by the campaign on the Soviet Union. And I'm interested in what is bringing the Jewish community together at the moment. What is uniting the community, and how is AJC engaging the emerging generation of Americans, young American Jews and others?
I think we spoke earlier about external challenges. If we're speaking about internal challenges, Jeremy, I think you put your finger on one of the great and enduring challenges facing American Jewry and perhaps over time, diaspora Jewry. So yes, there is also a fracturing of American Jewry. As a veteran of the Soviet Jewry movement, I saw that even though there were different organizations and even though there were different approaches, and sometimes the differences were magnified between this approach and that approach, by and large, we were totally unified in the goal, and it was a very exhilarating experience to see this large Jewish community focused on one goal, Shelach et ami, let my people go. I think it'd be very hard today to find a single galvanizing issue that would bring together American Jews in quite the way that the Soviet Jewry movement did, or frankly, even that Israel did in earlier years. Even the issue of anti-Semitism, which Colin referenced earlier in this discussion, only does to some degree. It does. We saw it just after the tragedy in Pittsburgh, the Tree of Life Synagogue. But very quickly, even the issue of anti-Semitism has become politicized for many. I mean, our viewpoint at AJC has been consistently that anti-Semitism is anti-Semitism is anti-Semitism. And those who want to weaponize it for particular political purposes are not doing the struggle any benefit. What I mean by that is we saw early on, beginning in 2000, 2001, initially in Europe, that there were three main sources of anti-Semitism, and we named them at the time, and we called them out at the time, and they were the far right, and they were the far left, and they were not Islam, but Islamists, jihadists. All three were threatening, all three were existentially important, and we insisted in our analysis of anti-Semitism that one had to be swivel-headed. And those on the right who only wanted to point the finger at the left, and those on the left who only wanted to point the finger at the right, were doing a disservice to the cause. And I'll give one illustration. A rather outspoken, controversial member of the US Congress from the state of Michigan, after the anti-Semitic attack in Jersey City, just across the river from New York, that resulted in 2 deaths of Jews, immediately tweeted, "White supremacy kills." But it turned out that in that particular case, it was not white supremacy that killed. It was not what happened in Pittsburgh or in Poway or the marchers in Charlottesville, Virginia. This came from a different source. This came from people who allegedly had a connection to Black Hebrews. It didn't fit the Congresswoman's narrative. She pulled the tweet, but not before we could all Photoshop it. And she lost interest in who the perpetrators were. And she sort of instead replaced it with bland, generic denunciations of anti-Semitism. To us, that's not a serious response to anti-Semitism. If you're serious about anti-Semitism, then name the source and focus on it. And if you're not, and you're simply trying to score political points, so be it. So the American Jewish community is also quite politicized, and this is a very polarized country now. That's not news for all of you in Australia. But American Jews are not immune from that polarization along political lines, along social lines, and therefore it's reflected in the way people react to Israel, to Donald Trump's attempt to portray himself as Israel's best friend in American presidential history, and even to issues of anti-Semitism. We're quite divided now, Jeremy, and it's not obvious how quickly we can reunite the community and under what circumstances.
Thank you. I think at this stage we'll go to some of the questions from other people.
Sure.
We could go on all day, but I think it would be great to share it around a bit. And the first person who has their hand up in the Zoom is Anthony Cohen. So we'll bring Anthony in. You'll be unmuted. And your question, Anthony, you're unmuted. Please go ahead.
David, thank you for your advocacy and your comments today. You mentioned before that some countries in Europe in particular would not be particularly happy. And I think these countries that you mentioned have such a history of being anti almost anything Israel does to survive, I think stands out for itself. And you mentioned that you have a party there, the Democratic Party, that is so far removed from the values that, in the past. Isn't it about time that we leave Israel to do what it has to do, champion what it does, because it is gaining support in other areas of the world. The Indian subcontinent and East Asia region is 2/3 of the world's population. I think that's where the future is, and that's where we should be doing more of our listening.
So, Anthony, thank you. Thank you for the question. Nice to see you. Look, we're all in favor of the pivot to Asia, as was discussed earlier in this conversation. But at the same time, we're not prepared to give up on bipartisan support from the United States. I did not suggest that we had lost the Democratic Party. Rather, in response to Colin's question about annexation, there were a number of Democrats who've spoken out against it. And yes, we have concerns, especially among the so-called progressive community in the United States, which largely identifies with the left wing of the Democratic Party. But first and foremost, the U.S.-Israel relationship remains, in our estimation, unique and irreplaceable for a whole host of reasons that I probably don't need to go into in this discussion. And secondly, Europe, too, is not simply a continent that can be left behind. When you sort of break down Israel's foreign relations, including its trading relationship, including its research and development, including its investment strategy, Europe looms very, very large. So even the countries that I mentioned, if I recall, France and Belgium and Spain, I would have Sweden, Ireland, and Luxembourg. I think were the six who were quite outspoken. Even there, it's not a complete black and white picture. For example, if you look at the French-Israeli relationship bilaterally, it's extremely strong, pretty much across the board, very strong. And yet, when it comes to multilateral settings, Brussels or the UN in New York, France is often more of a challenge. But I think we need to look at this in a more nuanced way and say, let's develop where we can develop. Let's cooperate where we can develop. There are many, many areas where we can do that. We'll disagree where we have to disagree, but we're going to try and compartmentalize and manage. Israel, yes, is a mature country. It's now, we're told, the 8th most powerful nation on earth, but it still has vast interests in the United States and in Europe, as well as its interests in Asia, Africa, and Latin America.
Thank you. Next question from Svi Fleischer. Svi.
Svi, could you unmute?
Unmute myself, sorry.
I
apologize. I thought I was unmuted. Good to see you, David. I wanted to ask about the UN a bit. The AIJAC, of course, has had a very active role in trying to encourage Jewish engagement at the UN, and amid all the many problems in the UN's many organizations. We notice in the midst of the COVID-19 crisis, there's been a lot of focus on the biases, nothing to do with Israel and the World Health Organization, which was usually considered one of the better organizations at the UN. Do you see much prospect at the present time for improvements at the dismal record of the UN to date from your own AIJAC context at the UN?
Well, first of all, and this is unscripted, but I read the review, and Fleischer has always been one of the people that I read and I see. So a big shout out to you, Tzvi. Look, I don't mean to make this a sort of permanent theme in response to every question, but the UN is also a very complicated entity, and Israel itself has concluded that as difficult as the UN can be for Israel, it's worth engaging rather than seeking to disengage entirely. I mean, there was a play on sort of the Hebrew acronym for the UN, Shmum, as if to say, who cares about the UN? What does it matter? And yet Israel keeps largely showing up at the UN. And in some respects, one can even say slowly its situation has improved. Not everywhere, not at the same time. I'm under no illusion. We continue to focus on the UN Human Rights Council, which is wrongly named. It's certainly not a human rights protection organization as it was meant to be. We're focused very much on agenda item number 7 of the Human Rights Council agenda, which is a permanent standing agenda item that focuses on Israel and Israel exclusively. There is no other country in the world that has its own separate dedicated agenda item. None of the human rights transgressors, not a single one, has a permanent agenda item. And of course, I think everyone on this call realizes that whether it's the Human Rights Council or the General Assembly in New York or the Third Committee in New York, that the number of resolutions adopted each year against Israel exceeds the number of resolutions against other countries combined normally. Comes very close. So this is absurd. Here again, I come back to the earlier comment. Here we rely very heavily as well on good countries like the United States and Australia, who have both been particularly outspoken, whether in New York or Geneva, in not only defending Israel, but framing it not just as a defense of Israel, but as the defense of the integrity of the United Nations. The UN Human Rights Charter, which was adopted 75 years ago, 1945, speaks about the equal rights of all nations, large and small. In other words, all nations theoretically are meant to be treated similarly at the UN. It's the charter itself that's being violated. So our argument with the UN is not just about the way it's treating Israel, but framing it also as, well, if the Human Rights Council is obsessed, for example, with Israel, then surely human rights victims, whether in Venezuela or Iran or Syria or North Korea or elsewhere, are being neglected. So Israel will survive the attention, but will the victims of human rights transgressions in those other countries survive without the attention? Because without the attention, we know from history, countries like the ones I mentioned will simply act with impunity, with no sense that the world cares, much less will react or respond.
Thank you. Our next question is all the way across in Perth, Steve Lieblich. Steve, you should be unmuted now. Go for it.
Thanks, Jeremy, and thank you, David, for the presentation and for everything that the AJC is doing in Chicago. The question I have relates to the Black Lives Movement, which we are seeing so much in the news in recent days. You'll recall in 2016 that movement published a platform on a number of issues, and on Israel, it was quite horrific, referred to Israel as an apartheid state, accused Israel of genocide, and generally echoed the sort of things we heard at the Durban conference in 2001 and the lawfare and BDS movement that we're seeing, which is delegitimizing and demonizing Israel. So now, in the wake of the demonstrations that we're seeing triggered by the horrific murder of George Floyd, we're seeing attacks on synagogues and Jewish shops. We're seeing a lot of Israel bashing on social media. I saw a cartoon recently of George Floyd in a keffiyeh with a Palestinian flag in the background. So I guess my question is, how does the AJC handle this this issue with the Black Lives Movement? And clearly we want to support, we certainly want to support the fight against racism, but this particular aspect of Black Lives Movement is obviously problematic. And so how do you handle that? And in general, perhaps, relations with the African American community?
It's again very large. I'll say again, it's a very large and complicated question. Again, the thread throughout this conversation. AJC was founded in 1906. Within 5 years, by 1911, we were already involved in anti-racism initiatives. Martin Luther King, whom we honored in 1965, recalled our work as early as 1911 in trying to fulfill the promise of America for all, and in particular, at the time, for African Americans. And by the way, I would just add parenthetically, that was at a time when the place of Jews in America was not necessarily completely assured. We were on the outside of the WASP, sort of Christian establishment of the country, relative newcomers ourselves on unsure ground. And yet those Jewish leaders at AJC understood that only a country which fulfilled its commitment to every one of its citizens, black, white, and others, would ultimately be the country that saw itself in the founding fathers' image of America as the shining city on the hill. So for us, this has been a century-long effort in anti-racism activities, in coalition building with African-American organizations, and that work continues to the present. In fact, it was in 2019, just last year, at our Global Forum in Washington, that members of Congress announced from our platform the rebirth of the Congressional Black Jewish Caucus, in which AJC sort of played a part in its reestablishment. So we're committed. The picture that you described is a part of the larger story, but it's not the complete story. The African American community in the United States is roughly 13% of the population. It's reflected by a multitude of organizations and elected officials, local, state, federal, and we work with the many with whom we find common ground. Those who reject Israel, those who depict it as an apartheid state, those who see it as somehow the enemy of racial progress in America are not going to be our partners. There are many, on the other hand, who see Israel as part of the solution, who understand, for example, that in recent history, the Israeli rescue of Ethiopian Jews is one of the very few instances in modern times where, as someone said then, Africans were brought out of Africa on planes to freedom and not in chains to slavery. So we have to tell the story of Israel's multiracialism. We have to tell the story about the relationship between Jews and blacks that's both historic and contemporary. But we have to navigate, because there is the intersectional movement in the United States. There are those exemplified by people like Louis Farrakhan and the Nation of Islam, who continue their unrelenting both anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. So we find our friends and our partners, and we distance ourselves from those who make clear that they don't share our goals and our values.
Thank you. Next question to Ben Ezzers. Ben, you should be unmuted. Please go ahead.
Thanks very much. I appreciate you taking the time, David. So I'm a Jewish educator working here at Moriah College, and I actually just came out of a Holocaust education class. So it's interesting to hear you talk about sort of the issues with Holocaust education in the Muslim world. And I know that in Australia, Holocaust education is compulsory in 2 of its states. So my question for you is, do you think that making Holocaust education compulsory should be part of the AJC platform?
Well, Ben, thank you. I actually, yes, Holocaust education, we believe, should be part of everyone's education. It's easier said than done as time passes and history fades, and survivors, including both my mother and my father, pass on, as liberators and eyewitnesses pass on. It poses a permanent challenge, I think, to educators to not only teach the facts and figures and dates about the Holocaust, but the immense human toll it took, and the slippery slope that it represents to liberal democracy. I think this is also one of the ways, Ben, that one has to talk about the Holocaust, that Weimar Germany, post-World War I Germany, was, for all of its challenges under the Versailles Treaty, it was nonetheless a democracy, but how thin the veneer of democracy was. And I think it's very applicable in the 21st century as we look around to remind ourselves how thin the veneer of liberal democracy that too many take for granted is. That, to me, is also one of the enduring lessons of the Holocaust. Just one other point then. One of the things that really concerned me during the last 3-4 months of the COVID-19 crisis has been the kind of usurpation of World War II language in the COVID-19 debates that we've seen here in the United States or in Brazil or other countries. And this sort of devaluation of language, this attempt to suggest that those who are living at home are somehow Anne Franks, those who are prevented from going out or going back to work are emblematic of the Gestapo that you may have seen in Brazil. Even some government officials of the current government, in wanting people to go back to work and downplay the health crisis, have used the words Arbeit macht frei, sort of stealing them from Auschwitz, trying to impose them on the current situation. And then, to me, therefore, it's not only what is and is not taught in the classroom, it's what are the messages that are taken away just in the more common use of these references to Auschwitz or to the Gestapo or to Hitler or to the swastika or to Arbeit macht frei, that we're seeing certainly in the United States that cheapen and trivialize the whole experience of the Holocaust. If being at home for 3 months with Netflix and Wi-Fi is equivalent to experiencing Gestapo domination, then what chance do educators have? So I think, we have to fight back. We have been trying to fight back. I've written several op-eds on the subject. AJC has been outspoken on social media as well, in order to protect the language. Because without language precision, language has no meaning. And without meaning, there is no history. And without history, there's no understanding of not only what happened, but potentially what might happen again, whether to us or to some other targeted people.
Thank you. Our next question, Aaron Shapiro. Aaron, you should be unmuted now. Go ahead. No, you're not unmuted.
No, I am now. Thank you, Jeremy. David, thank you. There seems to be a blind spot in much of the Western world about to the extent to which Palestinian rejectionism is responsible for the impasse in the peace process. The Trump plan acknowledges this, but to what degree do the politicians and the analysts and the general community in the U.S. understand this?
Jeremy, is that a Melbourne, Sydney, or Perth accent? Because I didn't recognize it.
Definitely Melbourne.
The Long Island side of Melbourne.
I get it. Okay. It sounds mighty like home to me.
Yeah.
The fact is that, June 5th, 4 days ago, we marked the 53rd anniversary of the start of the Six-Day War. And it was an opportunity, at least for us at AJC and perhaps for you at AIJAC, to try and remind the world of sort of the enduring lessons of the Six-Day War. It's not simply ancient history. Where we are today in respect to Israel and Palestinians is very much derivative of what happened in 1967. And of course, jump back to 1947, 1948. So like you, Aaron, I'm a big believer in sort of reminding people that, yes, there are going to be very vigorous and robust debates on annexation, on settlements more generally, on whether one likes or dislikes a particular Israeli prime minister. But that's not the alpha and omega of the conversation. The real question, and I think even in what Prime Minister Netanyahu is doing now, is to send a message. And the message is, it's now 53 years. or if you wanted 72 years, 73 years since the 1947 partition plan, do you simply expect Israel to hold this land in perpetuity until such time as a Palestinian leadership emerges that's prepared to sit at the table with Israel and compromise on a reasonable basis? And compromising on a reasonable basis means that both sides have to compromise on their core narratives. I think Israel has indeed already compromised on its core narratives. But when leaders of the Likud party began to speak about a two-state solution, whatever that two-state form ultimately takes, they've already compromised fundamentally on their core narrative. The Palestinians assert they have compromised, but in reality, whenever push comes to shove, in fact, they have not. So I think what Netanyahu is also saying is, if you think, you, the Palestinian leadership, the time is working on your side, that ultimately Israel will kind of crumble from within, succumb to the pressures of terrorism or boycotts or ICC submissions, or that eventually the BDS movement will somehow punish Israel and shove it into a corner. The message of Israel is to the contrary. Time is working on our side. We began with 650,000 people in the Yishuv when Israel was established. We now have a population of roughly 9 million. We are an OECD member. As I mentioned, we are viewed as the 8th most powerful nation on earth. We have a strong military. We have immigration. We have aliyah. We're a resilient people. We're not going anywhere. So when you, the Palestinian leadership, come to that recognition that it's going to be half a loaf and not a full loaf or nothing, then let's meet and let's see if we can find a durable compromise. So I think your point is central to this conversation and is too often forgotten when I hear diplomats and others saying, well, you know, I call it the Ioi Syndrome, if only Israel syndrome. So if only Israel did A and then B and then C and then D, somehow we would magically have a durable two-state agreement. But unless it comes from both sides, it's not going to happen. And that has to be the focus of our discussion as well.
Thank you. Next question to Jamie Hyams.
Yes, thanks. Thanks, Jeremy. Thanks, David. I actually want to ask one of the questions that's in the chat, because I think it's a good question from David Schlesinger, where he asks, could you comment on the Israel-US relations under a Democratic president, and will the Democrats try to unwind some of the Trump's initiatives? I would be interested in hearing how you think the Israel-US relationship would go if Joe Biden does win the election in November. Thank you.
Sure. So first of all, Jamie, I need to state that AJC is a completely, strictly, legally, temperamentally nonpartisan organization. So please don't read anything into what I say about any preference one way or the other. We're not into endorsing or opposing any party or any candidate for office here in the United States or elsewhere. Having said that, look, Joe Biden is no mystery to us. I mean, we've all known Joe Biden for decades. He's been in the US Congress. He has a long voting record. He's traveled to Israel any number of times. He's given any number of speeches. Many of us have met with him in smaller settings. I think it's absolutely fair to say that Joe Biden is a friend of Israel and understands the importance of the US-Israel relationship. I don't have any question about that. So Joe Biden himself, by the way, like Donald Trump, are both committed to the US-Israel relationship. You may like or dislike either of them for any host of reasons, but the fact of the matter is, fundamentally, when it comes to understanding why Israel is in the American interest, they both get it. The question, though, is not Joe Biden or his immediate entourage. The question is this Kulturkampf, this culture war that's going on inside the Democratic Party right now. By the way, there's a culture war going on inside the Republican Party, although of a very different nature. When you see people like Colin Powell or George W. Bush or Mitt Romney, saying out loud that they may or may not support President Trump for re-election. That's one kind of culture war going on inside the Republican Party. But in the Democratic Party, there is a culture war you see unfolding between, let's call it the moderate faction and the progressive faction. And when it comes to that culture war, the progressive faction has a rather different view of Israel and U.S.-Israel relationship. And that was exemplified during the primary season when none other than Bernie Sanders himself, on at least 2 or 3 occasions that I can remember, actually publicly referred to the Prime Minister of Israel as a racist. And that was also mentioned by another candidate, Beto O'Rourke from Texas, who also used the word racist in referring to Israel at that moment in time. I don't recall that happening earlier. And what surprised me was there was no immediate reaction from the Democratic Party to both Sanders and O'Rourke saying, look, you may have disagreements with Israel, that's fine, but to use this incendiary language does not reflect the values of our party. So therein, I think, lies the challenge that we have. Which Democratic Party will emerge when it comes to the U.S.-Israel relationship? And I think we'll have a hint of that this summer when the Democratic Party adopts its presidential platform, because this will be one of the presumably contentious issues. But I'm at least of the belief that if Joe Biden prevails, and if he's the standard bearer for the Democratic Party, he ought to prevail, that the U.S.-Israel relationship will be intact. Will there be differences? Yes. Was Joe Biden the vice president to Barack Obama? Absolutely. Were there tensions between the Obama administration and the Netanyahu administration? There were. But fundamentally, Joe Biden is committed to the U.S.-Israel relationship, and I think that's good news. So whoever wins the election on this front, I suspect we should be okay.
Okay, thank you. David, Colin, would you like one more question? Colin Rubenstein.
Thanks, Jeremy.
Thank
Thanks very much, David, for your perspective this morning and your stimulating comments. But one last question. I referred in my introduction to the ongoing existential threat to Israel. And nowhere is that more apparent than in the threat of Iran. I wonder if you'd comment on the status of the Iran nuclear deal, with Iran, blatantly violating it and marching closer to nuclear weapons capability, as we see, with the vile anti-Semitism we've seen coming from its leaders yet again in recent days. How is this playing out in the US debate? And more generally, how do you see handling Iran going forward?
Well, Colin, if there were more time, I would actually reverse and ask you the question, because you and I have also discussed how Australia views the Iran question, and I know you've had concerns in the past as well. But my answer will actually be tied to the previous question, and my answer to the previous question, because if the Democrats win in November, and right now, for whatever it's worth, the polls show that they're leading, but there are still 4 to 5 months left in the election, and that's a lifetime for both parties. But clearly, the Democratic Party will try and in some way re-engage the JCPOA. I think that's no secret. How they will re-engage it, will they simply try to sort of return to the status quo ante and re-enter the deal that was actually negotiated under the Obama administration, or would they, with the passage of time, revisit the deal and insist on changes to the deal? Remains to be seen. And obviously, those who have concerns about the Iran deal are not remaining silent here. Look, we'll have our first test in just a few months, Colin. You know this very well. In just a few months, actually legally under the deal, the arms embargo against Iran ends. I believe it's in October. I mean, it's completely unfathomable that if this just proceeds as written, that by October, Iran could go on the international arms market and make major weapons purchases from countries like Russia and China, presumably, and it would not be in violation of the JCPOA. So there are lots of issues here that will confront both the Trump administration, as long as it's in office, whether for another, 7, 8 months or another 4 years, and the Democratic administration if they take office in January. I find it hard to believe, Colin, that a Biden administration, if it takes office, would simply return to the deal as it was written It's too clear that there were too many holes in the deal then. You know those holes extremely well. The arms embargo is simply one. The weak language on missile development is clearly a second one. The regional mischief is the third one. And I can say this from very personal experience. This is not second or third or fourth hand. I sat on the 7th floor of the State Department, which is the floor where the Secretary of State and his entourage sit. I sat in their offices during the Iran deal on several occasions, and I heard them say their belief was the Iran deal would transform Iranian behavior. They believed that if the deal were signed, it would strengthen the so-called moderates in Iran at the expense of the extremists, that Iran's attention would turn increasingly domestic, that all the delayed projects of infrastructure, roads, sewers, hospitals, schools would be the brunt of their attention, and they would lessen their regional mischief. Well, it was a nice theory to listen to. In reality, it proved untrue, unfortunately. And now the question is, will those people, if they come back to power in November, recognize that in some respects at least they misread Iranian behavior? And will they be prepared to acknowledge it and reflect it in the way they go forward with Iran? So you can be sure whatever happens in November, AIJAC and like-minded institutions are going to be very much focused on the Iran issue because, as you said, Colin, it has been and remains an existential question for Israel and the Jewish people.
Thank you, David. Now, unfortunately, we have run short of time. There are outstanding questions, as always. All of us would love to be able to have many one-on-one conversations with you. I hope those who took part today, observing or participating, did get some benefit from it.